In this video, we will take a deeper look into permit trading. We will calculate the efficient allocation of permits, as well as their associated cost and quantity desired. In the scenario we will study, two firms produce the same good. Both sell every unit they produce and earn a profit theta on each good. Both firms pollute as a result of production, and we will assume that the only way to reduce pollution is by reducing emissions, as opposed to implementing technological or other abatement strategies. The relationship between emissions, represented here by E, and production of units, Q, is shown on this slide. The first facility emits at a rate equal to 1/2 of the square of units produced. The second is more modern and will emit half of the emissions for an equal quantity produced. A permit program is introduced by the government to control the associated pollution. Under this policy, each firm must own one permit per unit of emissions generated. Each firm is granted X sub O permits, which can be traded between them in a competitive market. Let's quickly review the variables that we'll be using to solve this problem. E represents the amount of emissions. X is the number of permits purchased. X sub O represents the initial permit quantities given to each company from the government at the beginning of the program. P is the price of permits once traded between the two companies. Theta is the price of the goods sold at market. And finally, pi is the revenue of each firm. Since each firm must own a permit for each unit of emissions, we can set E equal to X. Substituting the emission equation for each firm, we can determine how many permits each facility must purchase. In this case, we consider a negative purchase as a sell. You can see here that the amount of purchase by firm 1, equals their output minus the amount of permits already issued to them. This term here is the amount of emissions they generate due to the production of QI, and this is the amount of permits they already own. And for them to meet this criteria, they must own XI permits such that they meet this total quantity. We can also calculate the revenues of each firm, represented here. We calculate the firm revenue based on the outputs and costs from permit trading. Theta Q represents the revenue generated at market by selling Q amount of goods for a profit theta each. So that's total revenue from selling goods. PX represents the cost spent on purchasing permits. So this is money generated at market, and this is the amount of costs associated with abiding by the program. To determine the optimal output for each firm, we will do so in terms of maximizing revenue. And we will arrive at this equation. d pi over dq equals 0. Once the firm reaches a point where the marginal revenue of producing an additional good is 0, that's this criteria here, that means they have maximized their revenue. Substituting the revenue equation from the previous slide, we can determine the optimal output Q star. So we plug in our revenue equation into pi, we solve this differential equation, in this case for firm 1. Continue to simplify and solve for Q1. Once you do that, you find Q1 star. You can see that it's the ratio of revenue per good to price per permit. You can do this similarly for firm 2 and arrive at Q2 star. Notice how the optimal output production is independent of the permits owned. Now, by returning to the purchase equation found at the beginning of the problem, we can determine the proper allocation of permits. By substituting Q star, which we just found, for Q, we will find that firm 1 will purchase permits and that firm 2 will sell. So we solve the equation for how many permits each firm must buy to abide by the program and find that firm 1 is short X sub O over 3 permits. And we see that firm 2 has a surplus of X sub O over 3. That means firm 1 will buy this amount of permits from firm 2. I will focus on excess permit demand, represented here as ED. Under the initial permit distribution, firms may require additional permits in order to reach their individual maximum revenue criteria. This is called excess demand. This is calculated by subtracting the amount of permits a firm owns, which is X sub O in this case, from the amount it requires, X sub I. This can also be negative, and that will be considered excess supply rather than excess demand. By substituting X sub 1 into the ED equation, substituting this equation in for Xi, and Q1 star into this equation here for Q1, we can determine the firm's excess demand as this equation here. Similarly for firm 2, we find that their excess demand equation is represented here. In order to obtain market clearing, we must have the total excess demand equal to 0. Market clearing conditions are met when the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, in this case of permits. By doing this, we will arrive at the efficient permit price by adding the excess demands of the two firms we find P star. This is how you determine the price of the permits. We can continue to use this as we continue our example. Since firm 1 emits more pollutants, they must purchase more permits to reach their revenue maximization criteria. Firm 1 is essentially paying firm 2 to cut back production and emissions for them. Since firm 2 operates cleaner and can abate more cheaply, this is the reason why firm 2 will do so. Some may wonder why firm 2 would want to sell these permits to firm 1 at all. If they just kept their permits, they could produce more than firm 1 and dominate the market. This is not the case. The reason firm 2 sells permits is because it makes them better off as a whole. The marginal benefit of selling one permit is greater than the marginal benefit of increasing emissions. Therefore, firm 2 sells it to firm 1. Firm 1 finds it the marginal cost of purchasing a permit is less than the marginal cost of reducing emissions. As years go by, the government may most likely wish to reduce the emissions further. They will do this by removing permits from the market. The new allocations of permits can be determined by redefining X sub O. And that about wraps up permit trading. I hope this helped you grasp a firmer understanding of the way permit trading works and how to find efficient costs, allocation, and prices under a given scenario.